Hello, everyone. My name is Mushfiq Syed, and I'm a sophomore in chemical engineering. This is my presentation for the Undergraduate Research Conference. The topic for my research is the novel nanobubble inflation method for determining the viscoelastic properties of thin polyisobutylene. I've always been interested in research, and I was lucky enough to have the opportunity to research with Dr. McKenna in our chemical engineering department. The lab primarily focuses on polymer science. So introduction, what is a polymer? Polymer is a substance that has molecular structure consisting entirely of a large number of similar units bonded together. For example, plastic, anything polystyrene, polyisobutylene. The research for our purposes are very important because of the growing use of the polymers as a structural component in the microchip industry. There's an increasing need for the measurement of the mechanical properties of the films at the nanometer size level. For my experiment, the sample we choose was the high molecular polyisobutylene, which is a ring polymer. The purpose of this experiment was to find out the thickness of the PIB along with the nanoinflation method in order to recheck the data collected from the same research group by O'Connell, who was also part of the McKenna lab group. It is very important to produce what has been done before to validify the outcome. It is also very important to add more knowledge to the research we already have. So the procedure of the research. Firstly, I had to prepare the sample, 1.128% of polyisobutylene with toluene. After the creation of the sample, it had to be swirled for 24 hours in a swirler. And after it has been completed, I had to filter the sample so that there's no dust particles or any other remains of toluene left. After that, spin coater. Spin coating is a technique used to spread uniform thin films on flat substrate by centrifugal force. The solution of the material is dispensed onto the center of the wafer, which is rotated at a high speed. So firstly, we take a mica sheet and put the mica sheet on the spin coater here, and put the mica sheet there and drop 1 ml of sample, which rotates at a very high speed so that all the sample is spread equally across the mica sheet. After that, we take the mica sheet out and we do the sample transfer through the water medium. In order to do that, we cut the edges of the mica sheet and so that it can cleanly come out in the water as a float. We use the water medium here in a beaker, all DI water. I put the mica sheet in and the sample, the polyisobutylene floats up. When the polyisobutylene floats up, I use the 5-micron silicon nitride chip, also called the template, to pick the floating sample up. The sample is left out for about 24 to 48 hours to evaporate the toluene and for the PIB to set. Now that the sample is ready, we can talk about the AFM. The AFM is the atomic force microscope. It is a very high resolution type of scanning probe microscopy with demonstrated resolution on the order of fractions of a nanometer. For our purposes, we will be measuring the thickness of the polyisobutylene sample before we load it to this pressure cell. The AFM is a very complicated and precise equipment, so it must be handled very carefully. To run the test, first we need to make sure if the laser is hitting the cantilever. The cantilever is right down here. This is the picture of the AFM that we used in our lab. The cantilever is in the bottom and the sample goes right here. The cantilever, after the beam has been aligned, we cut the edges of the sample so that it can, since it's a non-contact mode, the cantilever goes up and down. So to calculate to measure the thickness of the sample. Since we're using the non-contact mode, the cantilever will never touch the sample directly. For our purposes, after I took the measurements of the PIB thickness, it was more than what was expected and found before in previous research. It was about 650 nanometers. If we go here, we can look at the data. We got about 650 nanometers of the height, which is very much off, and it's a very thick sample, which shouldn't have been the case. And so as I further my research, I would have to go through the process of de-wetting in order to avoid these holes that we found, and also to correctly measure the thickness. The project is still in progress due to COVID restrictions and issues in our campus and in our lab. I was not able to go to the lab infrequently in the last 2 semesters. So this is still a work in progress project, but there's a lot of learning here, a lot of learning curve. I had to create a lot of samples in order to figure out what is the best method. Filtration, which I talked about before, was a very big part of this project, since the first time I did it, the filtration, without infiltrating the sample, there's a lot more holes and other random dust particles in our sample when we measured the thickness. All the extra measurement comes from other unnecessary samples. Since I do not have the experimental data and observation, I'll describe what the nanobubble inflation test is. It is to perform experiments at different temperatures to determine the thermoviscoelastic properties of the polymer. From previous research from O'Connell and Dr. McKenna, testing results from the method have shown that the glass transition temperature, the TG of polyvinyl acetate, is virtually unchanged to film thickness of 27.5 nanometers, while for polystyrene, the TG is reduced to 40 Kelvin for 13 nanometer thickness films. I will continue to further my research regarding how the PIB would react to nanobubble inflation technique.